Okay, hello again. Now, Greenblatt refers to the appropriated historical document as the anecdote, and the typical new historicist essay omits the customary academic preliminaries about previously published interpretations of the play in question. For example, it begins with a powerful and dramatic anecdote as signaled, for instance, by Louis Montrose in the first sentence. Okay, I'm moving on to the next section, next title, New and Old Historicisms and some differences between the old and new historicism. When we say that new historicism involves the parallel study of literary and non-literary texts, the word parallel encapsulates the essential difference between this and earlier approaches to literature which had some use of historical data. These earlier approaches made a hierarchical separation between the literary text, which was the object of value, jewel, as it were, and the historical background, which was merely the setting and by definition of lesser worth. Okay, new historicism covers a parallel study, okay, between the literary and non-literary texts, fiction and non-fiction. So in this parallel, we see that there is an essential difference between this approach and the earlier approaches to literature. Because the earlier approaches to literature, like in new criticism, they disregarded history from it. But new historicism involves and it welcomes history. These earlier approaches made a hierarchical separation between the literary text, which was the object of value, it was the jewel, and the historical background, which was the setting. Only the setting of the story. So imagine that there's a story written these days, in Corona days, all right? And you exclude the setting. You think that, as literary critic, this is only the setting of this story. But new historicism says that, no, it's not only the setting. They are interrelated to one another. The story and the historical setting are interrelated to one another, and they interrogate one another. The COVID days influence the story, and the story influences the COVID days. So they are both interrelated into one another, intermingled into one another. This is called, as I said, equal weighting. The practice of giving equal weight to literary and non-literary material is the first and major difference between the new and old historicism. As representative of the old historicism, we could cite Tilliard's The Elizabethan World Picture and Shakespeare's history plays. These books are against which new historicism frequently defines itself. A second important difference between old and new historicism is that it is encapsulated in the word archival, and in the phrase the archival continuum quoted earlier. Archive. The recorded history is called archive. Because that word indicates that new historicism is indeed a historicist rather than a historical movement. Okay? It is not an approach which is about history, but it is a historicist approach, because historical means reading something in relation to history, but historicist means taking out some historical meaning from the text. This is different. Let me exemplify it this way. When you read Robinson Crusoe, for example, historical reading means you read Robinson Crusoe, all right, and then you read the historical texts, all right, and you say that this is a historical movement. Historical movement means trying to find historical elements there. All right, if there is a history, if there's a date given, or if there's a war being talked about in the literary text, then it's a historical reading, historical movement. You say that, oh, there's also the Civil War there. There's also this date, important date, the date of French Revolution is there. You say this is historical approach. But historicist movement, what is historicist movement? Historicist movement means that you argue from the point of history. You argue that this is a result of history. You can say that it's a result of history. For example, at the time of Robinson Crusoe, when it was written, there was a colonial movement, which is not mentioned in the book. It's not mentioned in the book, but you can claim that, yes, there are elements of traces of colonialism there. This is historicism, because it is related to the period in which it was said. That is, it is interested in history as represented and recorded in written documents. In history as text, historical events as such, it would argue, are irrecoverably lost. This emphasis bears the influence of the long familiar view in literary studies that the actual thoughts or feelings or intentions of a writer can never be recovered or reconstructed, so that the real living individual is now entirely superseded by the literary text which has come down to us. Okay, in the next paragraph, incorporated into this preference for the textual record of the past is the influence of deconstruction. Once again, we are back to deconstruction. It was the influence of deconstruction that made us speak about history again. New historicism accepts Derrida's view that there's nothing outside the text, in the special sense that everything about the past is only available to us in textualized form. It is thrice processed 3 times. First, through the ideology or outlook or discursive practices of its own time, then through those of ours, and finally through the distorting web of language itself. Okay, first, practices of its own time. Okay, history is recreated in the text by looking at what really happened then. All right? And then, secondly, those of ours, our own experience, the writer's experience maybe. And finally, the web of language itself. There's a specific language which talks about that history. Does it talk about that history as an invasion or an occupation? Independence or a revolution? All right? So, therefore, the language reshapes the historical story again. Whatever is represented in a text is thereby remade all the time. Okay? And new historicist essays always themselves constitute another remaking, another permutation of the past, as the play or poem under discussion is juxtaposed with a chosen document, so that the new entity is formed there. In this sense, the objection that the documents selected may not really be relevant to the play. And so we have a very important philosopher that we frequently quote and frequently refer to in our literary studies. Foucault. New Historicism and Foucault. What is the relationship between New Historicism and Foucault then? New Historicism is resolutely anti-establishment. All right, anti-establishment. What does that mean, anti-establishment? You're against the present system. All right? You're against the world system, the capitalist system, the country's system, the governmental systems. These are all establishment, all right? Hegemonic establishment. And when you are against the hegemonic establishment, you claim that you are a new, when you say that you are a new historicist, you also have to claim that you are against the establishment. You are an anti-establishmentarian. Always implicitly on the side of liberal ideals of personal freedom and accepting and celebrating all forms of difference and deviance. At the same time, though, it seems simultaneously to despair of the survival of these in the face of the power of the repressive state, which it constantly reveals as able to penetrate and taint the most intimate areas of personal life. This notion of the state as all-powerful and all-seeming stems from the post-structuralist cultural historian Michel Foucault, whose pervasive image of the state is that of surveillance. Michel Foucault said that the most important characteristic of a state is that of the surveillance. It watches us everywhere. Big Brother, remember Big Brother. Okay, he watches us everywhere. He sees us everywhere, and this is one of the most characteristic and pervasive characteristic of the state. And the panopticon was a design for a circular prison conceived by the 18th century utilitarian Jeremy Bentham. So panopticon means the design consisted of tiered ranks of cells which could all be surveyed by a single warder positioned at the center of the circle. So sometimes you see those in the films. There's a high round structure and the cells circle around you. So one watch guard can see all the cells. It's a panopticon structure. The state is like this, according to Michel Foucault. It's a panoptical structure. The panoptic state maintains its surveillance not by physical force or an intimidation, but by the power of its discursive practices. All right? Discursive is the adjective derived from the noun discourse. All right? Discourse, which circulates its ideology throughout the body politic. Right? The state, the ideology of the state creates a discourse, and by a discursive practice derived from a created ideological discourse, it watches all its people panoptically. All right, it takes them under control. There were examples of this I go back to early 1980s, after the military coup in Turkey in early 1980s. Certain words were truly prohibited by law of the military coup. By law, they banned the use of some of the words. You had to say hür instead of özgür. You had to say sulh instead of barış. Okay? You had to say inkılap instead of devrim, which was a panoptical, discursive structure. It was a discursive structure. What is its relationship to history then? As a new historicist critic, when you read a novel and when you see that inkılap instead of devrim, right? No problem. It's a word choice by the writer. All right. It's nothing to be criticized about it. But however, as a new historicist reader, you can claim that yes, this is a panoptical reflection of the panoptical state ideology here, because the novel is written in 1980s. All right, and so the words suddenly become quite ideological, and history, the remaking of history, also becomes suddenly very, very ideological too. Discourse is not just a way of speaking or writing, but the whole mental set. All right, a discourse shows a whole mental set, a mindset, and an ideology which encloses the thinking of all members of a given society. So in a given society, an ideological discourse takes the minds of all the people under its control. So people start believing that they should be thinking in the same manner. They should be speaking in the same manner too. And this is an ideological control, a discursive control on our minds. It is not singular and monolithic, so that the operation of power structures is as significant a factor in, for example, the family as in layers of government. Hence, contesting them may involve the struggle to change sexual politics just as much as party politics. So we were talking about the patriarchal language last week and the heteronormative language in a society, in a given society. In the same way, all states create the ideological norms of a society by discursive patterns. Okay, please remember, discursive patterns means the patterns created by a discourse all the time. Okay, now, on the whole, neo-criticism seems to emphasize the extent of this kind of thought control, with the implication that deviant thinking may become literally unthinkable, so that the state is seen as a monolithic structure and change becomes almost impossible. Okay, Foucault's work looks at the institutions which enable this power to be maintained, such as state punishment, prisons, the medical profession, and legislation about sexuality. Foucault makes a less rigid distinction than is found in Althusser between repressive structures and ideological structures. Then history becomes also the tool of the state. They create and recreate the history and use it as a tool in order to control the minds of its people. Right? So now let me close this session again and open the third session, start the third session in about 5 minutes. See you in 5 minutes.